Welcome to this last keynote session at this SIEF conference, and I can shortly introduce myself. I am Kirsti Salmi-Niklander and University Lecturer of Folklore Studies at University of Helsinki. And my assistant moderator is Ulla Savolainen. You can introduce yourself, Ulla.
Yes, I am Ulla Savolainen. I work as a researcher at the University of Helsinki in the Department of Cultures and Folklore Studies.
Yes, and I can shortly now tell these practical issues about questions. We will have some time for questions, and you can use the raise hand function if you like, and then you can present your questions live to Molly Andrews, or then you can also write your questions to the question and answer section in Zoom. And I have a great pleasure to introduce the last keynote speaker at this SIEF conference. Molly Andrews is Honorary Professor of Political Psychology at the Social Research Institute, University College London, and she is also the co-director of the Association of Narrative Research and Practice. Her research interests include political narratives, the psychological basis of political commitment, political identity, patriotism, and aging. And her books include Lifetimes of Commitment, Aging, Politics, Psychology, and Shaping History, Narratives of Political Change, both published by Cambridge University Press, and Narrative Imagination on Everyday Life by Oxford University Press. And Molly Andrews' writings are familiar and inspiring to all of us who are interested in narration, everyday life, and activism. She serves on the editorial board of 5 journals which are published in 4 countries, and her publications have appeared in Chinese, German, Swedish, Spanish, Czech, German, and Finnish. Ulla and I have met Molly in Finland on several occasions. In 2010, she was the keynote speaker in the Finnish Oral History Network Symposium. And for the academic year 2019-2020, she was the Jane and Aatos Erkko visiting professor at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. And we hope very much to be able to meet Molly back here in Finland soon. The questions of activism and resistance have been discussed in several keynotes and in many panels and papers during this conference. If this conference had taken place actually on site in Helsinki, you could have observed the demonstration of Elokapina, Extinction Rebellion Finland movement, which has been going on for almost a week and raised a lively public debate. Their tent camp is now placed on Senate Square, and I think that I heard some music from there when I left the university last night. Molly Andrews will provide us a biographical narrative and long-term perspective on these vital concepts and themes. So please, Molly.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to just begin by saying how honored I am to be invited as a keynote speaker here, and to say, along with everyone else, of course, we wish we were together in Helsinki, but you have done a really incredible job of bringing Helsinki to us, not least with our wonderful bicycle rides each morning and this wonderful conference. So thank you very much. I realize that the time is short, so I want to give a brief introduction and then I'll move to my paper. I wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much to my fellow keynote speakers who really have done a wonderful job in bringing us to various places in the world, to Botswana and southeastern Ohio, and to the Sami country, and of course Ellen Hertz's wonderful keynote, where she really challenges us to think, about rules as potentialities, not just as something that we resist. And all of these keynotes have been very stimulating to me. And I'm indeed going to invite you to accompany me to another place and time, and that would be East Germany, back in the late 1980s. And I'm going to tell you about that project in just a moment. But before I do so, I'm going to just frame it a little bit in terms of the theme of the conference, which is this not only breaking rules, but power, participation, and transgression. And I think we haven't talked so much about those other three. When I was invited to do this, immediately it was clear to me that I wanted to talk about the very messy methodology of this East German project that I've been working with and on for almost 3 decades. And I didn't want to talk about the project so much itself as what it means to do to work on a particular project over such a long period of time. Well, just very briefly, which rules does this project contest? And here I think I would say maybe not rules so much as conventions. And the first one I would say is that it contests this idea that we should think in binaries. And so the idea of, for instance, objectivity versus subjectivity. I think you'll see very much that my own sense and sensibilities are very much interwoven in the years in this project. Insider versus outsider. I'm very much an outsider, or I started out as one, but you don't always remain an outsider to people you've been talking with for decades. The idea that you should really do research in a place where you speak the language. I didn't speak German when I started, and I now only have really an understanding of it. Or the idea that you should really pursue research that is very, very well organized and planned. But much of what happened to me in this research project was based on serendipity, very good chance. And I tried to be open to that. The idea that we should write in academic language, which is often really punctuated with a lot of jargon. And my challenge has always been to do the opposite, to make these really important ideas as accessible as possible to many people, which is what I'm going to try to do today as well. Or the idea that we should be located strictly within a disciplinary boundary. Again, I think if you talk with a group of people for a long time, you see that economics and generations and history and politics and all of it comes together in the same lives. And the idea that our research should somehow be bounded, that it has a beginning and a middle and an end. This is a story of research that has not ended, that maybe perhaps will have no end. I don't know. So the focus of this paper is on the idea that doing scholarly research perhaps doesn't always have a clear beginning, middle, and an end. So it really sort of challenges this idea of the narrative structure of scholarship itself. So with that, I'll share my screen and talk you through this project that I've been doing for such a long time. So, hold on, I just need to move this as well. Okay, so I began this project back in 1992. I was interested in speaking with people who had been involved in the bloodless revolution in East Germany in 1989. And at that time, I interviewed 40 women and men, as you see here, mostly who were anti-state activists. And then by good chance, 20 years later, I was actually approached and asked if I would like to have the opportunity to re-interview some of these people. And indeed, I did that. And part of the project I did then in 2012 was also I commissioned a photographer, Von Melzer, to take pictures of people in places of their choosing. And I'm going to start with those in a moment. And then the year before last, as the Erko professor at the Helsinki Collegium of Advanced Studies, I was able to return to Berlin, this time for the 30th anniversary of the opening of the Berlin Wall. And there again, I did some interviews and, I spent some time there talking with people about this anniversary. But before I go talk to you about the project, I, in a sense, want to try my best to introduce you to the people in the project. So here's Von Melzer, and also the name of the archives where my research is kept. And Von, as I say, went to Berlin in 2012. And here are the pictures. So you'll see in the top layer are photographs of people around about when I first met them at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then pictures 20 years later. And these are the people in my study. And you will actually, in the course of my talk, learn more about them. But I wanted you to have a visual on them, because also just seeing what they look like and how this time has changed us, I think, is important as well. And then finally, I don't think it would be fair to leave myself out of it. This was what I looked like at that time. We also, in 2012, made a short video about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we're going to show you just the very first minute of that film at this moment.
Ich habe morgens um 9 Uhr auf dem Alexanderplatz gestanden. Ich habe da gestanden und habe also gedacht, um Gottes Willen wird das peinlich, wenn jetzt nichts passiert, wenn also so wenig Leute kommen. Während ich noch gestanden habe, kamen so die ersten U-Bahn-Züge. Und auf einmal kamen aus diesen Schächten Mengen von Leuten mit selbstgemachten Transparenten und Schrifttafeln, die in der U-Bahn offen getragen haben, wo man also noch vor 3 Tagen also sofort ins Gefängnis gekommen wäre dafür. Das war also der schönste Augenblick an diesem ganzen Tag, zu sehen, wie die Leute ihre Sprache wiedergefunden haben und ohne Angst auf diesen Platz gekommen sind und sich hingestellt haben und gesagt haben, wir wollen nicht mehr.
Für mich ist die deutsche Einheit insgesamt Alltag geworden. Der 9. November 1989 für mich auch keine emotionale Bedeutung mehr. Außer wenn ich mich an 89 zurückerinnere. Ja, dann weiß ich, wie aufgewühlt ich war. Aber der 9. November 2009 war für mich.
Okay. So I hope that will have given you a sense of what it was like to not only the people, but actually to talk to them about the same topic, separated by 20 years. And I'm happy to talk at all about the photographs or indeed the sound archives. The sound from that was indeed the sound from the actual demonstrations from autumn 1989. But for me, the question is about my relationship with these people who I've been studying, but really working with, and indeed have become quite good friends with some of them. As I say here, I struggle against the impulse to silence myself, resisting the voice within me telling me that what and how I have come to know are too complicated, perhaps too personal, to be captured within a scholarly framework. Have I traveled too far in for too long? And for me, these are open questions. I don't really have an answer to them. Of course, when I started out, it was a lot easier because I didn't know them and I knew exactly what I wished to research. And that was, I wanted to interview the people who had formed this group, Neues Forum, in 1989. And I was just going to do one-off interviews with them about a very particular historical moment. But as some of you might have found in your own work, scholarship, which sits at the intersection of biography and history, is never really finished, okay? And in my case, it has been exactly the case. So as I mentioned, I first returned to these interviews and to these people in 2012. But it's quite a 20 years is quite a pause in time to try to pick up a conversation. And what I did is, first, it was quite complicated trying to track down some of the people, but I sent them, the people who agreed to be part of it, I sent them digitized recordings of our original interviews, as well as a biographical questionnaire asking them what they had been up to. And this first step of the interview, where I asked them about their experiences of listening to the interviews, was in some cases very, very profound. So here, for instance, is a excerpt from an interview with Ruth Reinecke. And in the time since I had seen her, she had actually become a very, very well-known actress in Germany and beyond. And she describes to me, she says, after I was in the mood to listen to these old tapes again, in other words, I had sent her the sound recordings, and she left them around the place for a while. And then she finally said, okay, when I will listen to these old tapes again, I was really surprised how clear my answers have been. I listened to myself as Ruth, new and strange at the same time, but also, and she goes on to say that, in fact, she is very recognizable to herself as well. That's an experience that was mirrored by other people. Andre Brie, who you just saw in the recording, he says to me, I couldn't really remember having given such a long, differentiated interview. I was surprised in many ways that I found a lot of strands in my thought and my convictions, my experience that continue until this day. I'm surprised I answered so openly. I'm surprised how clear I was back then. He goes on and on. In this short passage here, he says the word surprised 5 times. But what is he surprised at? He's surprised by how recognizable he is to himself, as it were. He says at the end, I had many experiences since then, of course. These experiences changed some things in me, but not the core of my personality. So it was quite a profound experience for some of them, and indeed for me to hear this from them. Now, of course, it's not only their lives that were changing in this time, but indeed the national and the international acknowledgement of the anniversary of the fall of the wall. I think that we can safely say that the fall of the Berlin Wall has become one of the iconic political moments of the 20th century. And this anniversary and the acknowledgement about it has been really international. But for me, I was quite interested in the movie that I made that you saw at the beginning of it, was what does November the 9th actually mean to you? We know what it has come to be symbolized as. Well, here is a really lovely, very small excerpt of something. This is Sebastian Flugbeil, a nuclear physicist, and he wrote this to me in a note, but I just love this. He says, this is about the 10th anniversary of the fall of the wall. He says, all the political heavyweights had come to Berlin, Gorbachev, Bush Sr., the fat Kohl. A couple of days before, they realized they simply forgot to invite the real revolutionaries. It caused a big alarm. And then they decided that 3 revolutionaries were allowed to talk for 3 minutes, not more. I was the 3rd. It was funny that the organizers wanted to read in advance what I would say. I kept them on tenterhooks, did not show them the text, because there was a very clear message that was supposed to be being sent out, and he was not going to play that. It was damp cold, and the celebs were allowed to warm themselves up in the tent. I was sitting behind Kohl, who was sitting on a weak folding chair, and all the time I had to think about what would happen if the chair collapsed, and I was buried under him. So that was for him the 10th anniversary, which I thought was rather wonderful. And on the 20th anniversary, Hans-Jürgen Fischbeck, who is a cleric, he actually describes what was for him this unbearably sugar-sweet celebration, the song that was filled his ear, that was spread across the whole area with loudspeakers. Now freedom is here, freedom. I had to think of the people who get unemployment benefits, who must think twice before even being able to buy a streetcar ticket. And then for the 25th anniversary, and here I show you some personal photographs. On the left, I'm walking there with my mother, who who no longer is alive. And my parents had insisted on coming to Berlin, where I was hosting where I had put together an exhibition. And here they are sitting at this middle photograph with a bunch of these East German activists. And for me, this was really an extraordinary moment in my life. And then on the right, there's Ruth Reinecke and her husband, looking at how her experience was being represented in this exhibition. So this 25th anniversary was quite something for me. And I felt acutely the time that had passed when I went for the 30th anniversary. And the first thing many people asked me was, how's your mother? My mother made a big impression on them. But interestingly as well, is that for many activists, they say that November the 9th is simply the wrong date. So with Irene Kukutz, I asked her, how did she react the night of November the 9th, 1989? And she says to me, well, with a serious depression that lasted 3 days in bed, for me, that was my personal collapse. Or Bärbel Bohley, the mother of the revolution, as she was called, though she hated that name, she said to me, when the wall fell, it was a blow to the self-confidence of the people, that the wall was not torn down by the people, but that the Communist Party somehow thought, so now we're opening the gates. So the old power opened the gates, and that was a blow to people's self-confidence. Irene Kukutz says to me, well, what did we really want? We wanted, of course, to read many books that were forbidden in the GDR, to have as many newspapers as possible, et cetera, et cetera. That was the central point. Only behind closed doors in the churches could we have these kind of conversations. I never longed for the West in the sense that I would have wanted to leave East Germany to live there. I wanted to travel, but that was not the thing. And then she tells me this very moving story where she and her two closest friends, Bärbel Bohley and Katja Hoffmann, all three very well-known East German activists, she says, in the summer of '89, we decided to go to Italy. This was obviously when the wall was still closed. And she said, it really happened. Even though the wall was still standing, we said, we will go to Italy, come what may. This was like dreaming. One day, possibly, hopefully. And she says, we had gathered together in Mecklenburg in the summer of '89, Bärbel Bohley, Katja Hoffmann, and I, and we said, next year, we are going to Italy. And they laughed because, of course, it seemed so impossible. I have to say, once I went and we were crossing the Alps, I felt like the moment when the borders were opened all over again, a complete collapse, because I couldn't help thinking, with what right did they keep us locked up for all those years? With what right? Why wasn't I allowed to see this earlier? I felt I had been betrayed for a good part of my life, crossing these mountains. Next spring, we went there. I cried a river. So you can see that for her, this was what she thought she was fighting for. So for the activists that I know and have spent all these years interviewing, for them, the special date was not November the 9th, but in fact, October the 9th, when they had the huge demonstration in Leipzig, which in fact was not violent. They had worried that it would be violent. You have to remember this was only some months after Tiananmen Square. And Egon Krenz, who was then the head of East Germany, he was the person who had gone to China to congratulate them on their effective putting down of the protest. So the big worry was that this would happen here. And so this was the date that for the activists was the most important. And Sebastian Flugbeil says to me, for him, November 9th, with the collapse of the wall, that was really the end of the revolution. The height from which we fell was pretty far above the ground. We had the dream, and in a few weeks in autumn '89, the feeling that as a normal citizen, we could discuss and influence the problems of society. That was the most interesting time in my life, those 2 months. That stopped suddenly on the 9th of November. So you can see here that it's a very different feeling about the opening of the wall as being the commemorative date. So the question then, and which I keep returning to over these years, is really, well, what and how and who to remember? And as Sebastian Flugbeil said to me in November, he said, it's quite carefully depicted that the decisive event was intended to be, I should say here, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. It was at least an ambivalent story. And here we have Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. And Reinhard Weissun, another one of the participants in my study, actually talks about the controversy about who is going to actually be allowed, invited to speak at different commemorative events, who is posing as the revolutionary heroes. And I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's a little longer. I want to leave us time, but he says, some people are presenting themselves as if they are these revolutionary people when in fact they are not. And so he says, this is happening in the context of a debate which is fed by different sources, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, they say it, 1989, was not a revolution. And secondly, if it was a revolution, it was communist reformers who brought it about. And if it wasn't them, it was those people who want to leave the country. It was, from this version of the story, it was decidedly not the opposition groups in the GDR. And so I say to him, and you, the opposition, become quite erased in this story. He says, minimized, disqualified, relegated to peripheral figures. And here the image I have is Wir sind ein Volk. We are one people. This move that went from we are the people to all of a sudden a push towards a unified Germany, which was nothing that the revolutionaries had actually wanted. So this revisiting of what does this anniversary actually mean comes time and time again in our conversation. So in the last conversation I had with Conrad Weiss, who was a filmmaker, again, one of these activists, he says, the celebrations of this November the 9th feel like a campaign. That means there are days or weeks or maybe even still a year where the events of that period are the center of the focus, but it's not present in the everyday memory of the country. It's not integrated into general history books. When you look at school books, it's only really touched upon. So I ask, this is me asking Hans-Jürgen Fischbeck, well, what is it that you would like, how would you like the revolution to be remembered? And he poses two questions. He says, well, why was this revolution a peaceful one without violence, despite what had just happened in Tiananmen Square? How was it that there was no violence? And what does that teach us about the critical situation in the world today? Constantly bringing it back to this current situation. And here, one of the saddest things for me about my interviews in 2019, what had changed so radically since the last time I had interviewed people, was the rise of the far right, the AfD, and other groups as well. And one of the most cynical things which had happened in this time was that the words of 1989 of the revolutionaries were being actually used to galvanize people on the far right. So here you see a AfD demonstration, which is actually using the words Wir sind das Volk, we are the people. They say, well, we are finishing this revolution that was only started in 1989. Because we are going to stand up for German rights against immigrants, etc. Ruth Misselwitz, again, in my study, says this feeling of achievement was broken down in the course of East Germany being dismantled. This of achievement of having realized a bloodless revolution. And she says, my work over the past 30 years has been to give the people here in the East this self-confidence, this pride back. I helped to organize many seminars with the aim to convey to East Germans, what did you achieve in 1989? What injuries were inflicted in the 1990s? Because it is important to talk about this, to speak about the pain, but also about what they can be proud of. And only with that does she think that they will be able to move out of this very critical moment in in German history right now. So I would then like to finish, first with a quote by Reinhard Weissun to give you a sense of these long conversations, and then we will end with a clip of the film again. So I say to Reinhard Weissun, he still lives in the very same place that he has lived all these years. It's nearly 3 decades. And so I say to him, we've been talking almost half my life. And he says, he almost never speaks English, but he says at that moment in English, yes, and mine also. And so I sort of laugh and I say, this is a very long conversation. And we both laugh. As the interview closes, and acknowledging that in our long and intensive discussion, we have covered many complex issues, I ask him sort of half jokingly, I say, well, how are you going to solve the rest of the problems of the world? And he responds again in English, later, to which I come back next time in 10 years for our next conversation. And we both laugh here. So how I would like to finish then is with, again, a clip from the film that we made. And the speaker is a person by the name of Wolfgang Templin. Templin was referred to by Erich Honecker as the #1 enemy of the state. He had one of the singly biggest Stasi files, and he was an extraordinary person. And he was, in fact, on November the 9th, 1989, he was in the West because he had been exiled there. And so he used that opportunity to actually come back to East Germany. So now I would like to close with just a short segment of him speaking about what 1989 means to him.
Ich habe diese Nacht anders als die anderen empfunden, weil ich ja auf der anderen Seite der Mauer war. Ich war in Hamburg im Zusammenhang mit dem Exil und ich bin gleich am Morgen von Hamburg losgefahren mit dem Auto, aber ich kam nicht in den Transit rein, man hat mich immer noch zurückgewiesen. Und ich bin dann mit dem Flugzeug nach Berlin und bin am Nachmittag illegal in die DDR, also ohne Kontrolle. Ich habe also den Fall der Mauer genutzt, um in die DDR einzudringen. Und ich bin in den Strom der Menschen hinein, in die DDR und habe dann gejubelt und mich gefreut, als ich in die DDR reingerannt bin. Ja. Aber nicht glücklich, dass ich in der DDR war, sondern dass ich die Freunde wiedersehen konnte. Und das war ein Freitag und am gleichen Abend war eine große Veranstaltung des Neuen Forums in der Gethsemane-Kirche. Und dort hat man meine Rückkehr gefeiert. 3 Wochen später sind wir dann alle zurück, also mit den Kindern und der Familie, richtig zurückgesiedelt.
Ja, und 89, ich habe 89 nie als nationales Ereignis gesehen, sondern immer als europäisches. Und 89 ist die Gesamtheit, in der wir ein Ausschnitt sind. Yeah. Also ich sage immer die Kette der friedlichen Befreiungsrevolution.
Okay, so I think you can hopefully have heard from the end. I don't know if you were able to read all the translations there. But for him, he was saying that 1989 is an unfinished event. And I would like to say that indeed that sort of mirrors the experience of doing this research, which seems to be, despite my best plans at trying to end it at certain points, seems to be also rather ongoing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Molly.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you for your compelling and deep keynote, and thank you for sharing your work with us. I think that your research really stands as a manifestation of the value of long-term research. And now if the audience has questions, you can ask them by raising your hand and we give you a right to speak, or just by using the Q&A function.
There's
I
one
think we
question.
have.
So, is there one question now?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I can read it, yes.
Okay, yeah.
It's in question and answer from Patrick Laviolette. A technical ethnological question, if you don't mind. Who is the central figure in the gathering photo from the 25th anniversary with your mum? That year, the light balloons, Einstürzende Neubauten, played 3 nights at Tempodrom in Potsdamer Platz. The singer of that band, Blixa Bargeld, looks like a lot of those seated anonymous revolutionaries. Yes, I hope I could read it okay.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear that so well. Ulla, could you say that? What was the question?
You can see these.
Yes. That who is the central figure in the gathering photo from the 25th anniversary with your mom? That year of the light balloons, Einstürzende Neubauten played 3 nights at Tempodrom in Potsdamer Platz. The singer of that band, Blixa Bargeld, looks a lot like one of those seated anonymous revolutionaries.
That I think is only that's just a coincidence, actually. But it was really quite an extraordinary moment, and there were many people who were there, actually. And actually, I must tell you that it was quite extraordinary because we were in this hotel, actually, just having tea, and there were all these sort of newspaper people outside. Both of my parents were newspaper people, and they were like, I wonder what's going on here. And I was like, oh, it's just, I was poo-pooing it. And all of a sudden, my mother, who could also barely walk at that time, but she just leaped up. I saw this journalist side of her when she had this instinct, and who was just walking through this lobby here, but Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, who had played such a critical role in of course, 1989 changes. And so that was really quite thrilling. So he was definitely there. We were a few feet away from him, but anyway.
Then there's another question by Claudia Wilps. How did you manage the interviews in German language when you have not really understood what the interview is said in German? And when did you decide to use the clear names of your interviewees?
The real names?
The real names, yes.
Right, okay. So 2 things. One is I never could present myself as a Germanist. I'm not. Mm-hmm. And of course, and this project, although it really borrows from history, is not that. I'm actually, that's not my field. And so if I was to do this project, it would have to be through a translator. Now, the interesting thing was that I have a very, very close friend who was willing to do this interpretation for me. But she is Birgit Schmidt, and she is also in those pictures there. And the project was a very, very intense, intimate one, also not just for me and the respondents, but for me and Birgit and them. And we actually talked very, very much about this language issue and also the relationship between us. I have to say that I could understand quite a lot, but my relationship was also very, very much built integrating this relationship with Birgit as well. In terms of using their real names, this is also a very interesting question. Because again, this you could say is breaking a rule, because we have this sort of idea that in fact you should use pseudonyms, and that we somehow, and the idea of that we, who owns the data and all the rest of it. The first time I actually even came close to asking people about what name would they like to be known by, and about signing release forms and all the rest of it, I put so much distance, so much chill in the room. That was just such a bizarre and Western capitalist idea for them that I would be introducing this. And they very definitely wanted to be known by their own names. And the idea that I wanted to I have done now all the formalities because I need to, because they've been archived. But in the early 90s, it was absolutely, I had to make a decision. Do I want to actually have these conversations, or do I want to stay very close to standard protocol? And I went forward with the conversations.
Yes, then there's 2 more questions there at least. Sarah Green asks, thank you for your great talk. One issue that seems to arise from it is that the revolution that people were looking for was not Western, but instead to change how things worked at home in the East. Was that how people talked about it in 1992 as well? Or has that narrative changed over time?
It was very much talked like that at the time. And I would say to anybody that since our time now is so short, please feel free to write to me, at the email that's listed with the conference. But no, it was absolutely felt like that from the very moment, actually, from the day when the wall was opened in that way. People felt very much like they didn't want to lose their country. That wasn't what they were trying to do. That's why I shared with you that long excerpt from Irena Kukuts. She wanted to read certain books. She wanted to travel, but she wanted her country. She certainly didn't want to be, absorbed into West Germany. Not at all.
Yes.
And the next question comes from Riikka Aro. This is very impressive and moving. May I ask, how have you as a professional dealt with the emotional aspects of doing this research? To relive, if in a distant way, these experiences was quite a lot breathtaking.
I think that one of the things that we need to do as scholars is to actually allow ourselves to feel more, not less. That's why I started by questioning this whole objectivity and subjectivity. It's not that, both are important, but I think that it would simply not have been possible to do this research and not to have been deeply affected by it. Now, one of the things is that, as I mentioned, I was really close to Birgit, and sometimes the stories were so harsh and difficult that we would just need to go into a park and be together and be quiet and let our bodies just physically recover a little bit before we would bring this energy, as she would call it, into the home of her family and her new baby and all the rest of it. So I think allowing yourself to feel it is very important part of the process. Yeah.
Yes. So we got reminded that we only have 1 minute left, or we had some time ago. Maybe I just read the next question or comment by Regina Bendix, and then you will have a chance to answer this rest later on, or we have time to discuss during the final event. Today, Regina Bendix writes, thank you for this evocative presentation. I also appreciate your mention that having research as an ongoing process entangled with one's own biography. Today's regime of grant applications and impact precision does not give respect to the fact that research stays with us, that we do go back to sites and thoughts, and that ideas emerge that were not anticipated in regular 2-3 year grant. The narrative that emerges here is crucial also for present-day Germany. I often wonder, living there, how things would be if 2 Germanys had emerged out of 1989. So sorry, we now have to finish in here, but thank you, Regina. It was really fine comment, and so that we will. And thank you once again, Molly, for your wonderful talk. These are certainly very important questions that we need to think and discuss in our research. And so, in 15 minutes, we'll be starting the closing event, breaking the rules of this session. But then we will, I hope, Molly, you can join us later on in the evening. We will have these more free discussion sessions. Yes. So
thank you very much.
And we will be meeting again in 5:15 in this next event.
Thank you,
Thank
Molly.
you, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Molly, and thank you for all questions and comments. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.